Okay, we're gonna work on watercolor painting. We have our paints, and I've taken out the black. We have a number 12 watercolor brush, and I'm gonna drop water in just the darker colors, the brown, purple, blue, and green, and activate it, just like I do on my palette. You get in some water, clean your brushes between the colors, and you can see how little of color I have on my palette, but I want to just activate the colors. Now, I'm looking at the reference photo that I'm going to paint from, and I'm looking at the shapes. And I'm going to be painting the shadow colors of that nose. Leaving the whites white, I check how wet my brush is so it's not dripping off the paper. And I want to paint in a value of where that shadow, kind of blur your eyes, and you want to paint everything but the white. So I'm painting the shape, and you can see how little of water I have in, how little of pigment I'm using. I painted around on the right side, the lighter part, so I have a shape that's lighter. This is called a wash. And you see the drips that I have? If it drips down, don't worry about it. But they hold, if you don't get too soppy of a brush, it won't drip off the paper. It'll just kind of hold there. And you can see I'm going to paint that shape under the eye. I am drying off my brush on a sponge, but you can have a Kleenex or a folded paper towel to just dry off your brush. So I go from the water and I wipe off my water, and then I go into my paint. So I'm not diluting my paint color anymore. And here again, I'm looking at the shape. I've been using just the blue, and pretty soon I'll be adding purple to it. See, I've changed my color, always changing color. This is like almost transparent, but so it's almost like the lighter shadow value that I'm painting now. And I just work around. I don't just work in one place. I go over the entire mini painting. I'm going to call it a mini painting that we're doing. And with a dry brush, did you see me dry off the brush? I just sucked up the drips of water so they won't drip. Now I added some green. Did you see me wonder which way to place my brush? I'm always thinking about how I can just push a color onto the paper, and a lot of times it's the shape of the brush. Now this is still wet, so the pigment will always drop into anything that's wet. If it's dry, it won't drop down. So you can see some beautiful self-blending. Isn't that pretty? And I'm not worried if it goes too far, but I'm just dropping in some color. This is more of a brown and green into the darker areas. All of this will dry 3 shades lighter, so I'm not really too concerned about getting it too dark. But also know that if the paper's wet, I cannot put much more water on. Now this one, I'm looking at where my shadows are. I'm keeping my finger on my picture so my eyes know where I am. And there, I'm going to paint that shape across the lip line. And then I see the nose. If you squint your eyes, they're kind of the same value of darkness. So I paint those all in right now, that value. Squint your eyes. You want to leave the white of the paper, so I'll paint around those lip highlights. But I can see the side of the lip, it's actually darker than the lip. Squint your eyes so you can see value. You're painting the value of this lip. I'm going to paint around that white spot. And every time that I paint on top of another, when I put another layer on top, it'll get darker, especially when it's dry. Now there I was touching, so it kind of like blended itself in the wet. So I want you to experiment and try and see what works for you. This is our first step of learning how our watercolor is going to respond to this paper and how thin. You don't need much pigment. You can see I really haven't dipped into my wells. It's such a little bit of amount. And here's another color, brown, green, and purple. Kind of a darker. And I'm going to put this in the darkest area. It's not black, but I mixed my own darker value. Brown, purple, and green. And a little bit more, touching in the dark shapes. And those are little shapes, that line. Very little water, a dry brush picking up my pigment. And so work on the drawings that you have drawn for today.